The library was old, but cozy. It sat in the middle of a small town, tucked between two busy streets. The building had a quiet charm: wooden floors, tall shelves filled with books, and the smell of old paper hanging in the air. It was a peaceful place, where people came to read, study, or simply enjoy the silence. The library wasn't always crowded. There were regular visitors, like the elderly man who came every Wednesday to read the newspaper, or the mother who brought her kids every weekend. But there was one boy who came in every single day. He wasn't like the others. His name was Jake. He was about 12, with messy brown hair and a worn-out jacket that looked a little too big for him. He never borrowed books. He just sat at one of the long wooden tables, flipping through pages for hours. No one really knew much about him. But every day he'd be there, lost in the world of books, his face serious and focused. It was like he was searching for something, but no one knew what. The librarian, Miss Clara, had noticed him a lot. At first it seemed normal, but as the days turned into weeks, she began to wonder, why did he stay so long without checking out any books? Clara had been a librarian for over 20 years, and she prided herself on keeping the library organized and running smoothly. She had seen all kinds of readers: students studying for exams, older folks looking for new novels, and children lost in picture books. But Jake was different. He wasn't a typical visitor. He never seemed to need anything. He didn't ask for help finding a book, or for any recommendations. He just read. All the time. At first it didn't bother Miss Clara, but as the weeks passed, she started to grow frustrated. Jake would come in every single day, sit at the same table, and read the same stack of books. He never checked anything out, never interacted with anyone. He just stayed there, hour after hour, quietly turning pages. Miss Clara couldn't understand it. She thought about it during her lunch breaks, at night, when she was locking up the library, and even during the quiet moments between visitors. What was the point of coming to the library if you weren't going to take any books home? Was he just trying to waste time? She had seen many kids come in to read, but they usually took a book home with them. Jake didn't. And that bothered her more than she cared to admit. Maybe she was being too harsh, but it just didn't make sense to her. She started to feel annoyed, even angry. It wasn't right, was it? Why waste the library's time and resources like that? The more she watched him, the more her frustration grew. One afternoon, Miss Clara could feel the frustration building up inside her. Jake had been sitting at the same table for hours, his face buried in a thick book. This time it was different. She had reached her breaking point. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the table where Jake was sitting. He didn't notice her approach. His eyes were fixed on the pages, his brow furrowed as if he was completely lost in the story. "Jake," she said, her voice firm but calm. He looked up, blinking as if she had interrupted his thoughts. "Yes, Miss Clara, why do you come here every day and read so much, but never borrow any books?" she asked, trying to keep her tone even. "The library is for people who take books home, who really need them. What's the point of just sitting here all the time?" Jake paused, his eyes lowering to the book in his hands. For a moment he didn't answer, and Miss Clara's impatience grew. Was he avoiding the question? Did he think he could just waste the library's time? Finally Jake spoke up, his voice soft but steady. "I like to read here. It's the only place I can read in peace." Miss Clara frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "The library is open to everyone." Jake looked up at her, his expression distant, as though trying to find the right words. "I don't have many books at home," he said quietly. Miss Clara was taken aback. She had never expected that answer. Miss Clara felt a brief moment of guilt as she looked at Jake. His words lingered in the air, making her pause. But that guilt quickly faded, replaced by frustration once more. She wasn't sure why, but she couldn't help herself. "Not having books at home doesn't mean you should spend all your time here," she said sharply. "If you really wanted to read, you'd find a way to get books. You can't just take up space without giving anything back. You're wasting your time here." Jake's face fell. He looked down at the book in his hands, his fingers tightening around the edges of the pages. He didn't say anything. The silence between them grew, thick and uncomfortable. Miss Clara didn't know what had come over her. Why had she said that? Why was she being so harsh? She hadn't meant to sound cruel, but it just came out that way. It wasn't like she hated the boy. It was just that she had been watching him for so long, and it bothered her that he didn't take the opportunity to do more, to actually borrow a book like everyone else. But seeing him so quiet now, so hurt, made her feel small. She realized she had judged him, without knowing his story. She had assumed he was just being lazy or wasting time. But the more she thought about it, the more she knew she had been wrong. But it was too late. The words were already out, and Jake was already shrinking into his seat. Just as Miss Clara stood there, staring at Jake, a voice interrupted the silence. "You know, you're wrong about him." Miss Clara turned quickly, surprised by the voice. A man had walked over, a middle-aged man with glasses and a kind face. She hadn't noticed him standing there. He was holding a few books in his hands, but his attention was fully on her. "What do you mean?" she asked, a little defensive. The man gave her a gentle smile. "I've seen that boy here almost every day. He's not wasting his time, he's trying to learn." Miss Clara blinked confused. "But why doesn't he borrow the books? He could take them home." The man shook his head, his expression softening. "Jake comes from a poor family. He can't afford books. The library is the only place where he can read without anyone judging him." The words hit Miss Clara like a slap. Her heart sank as she glanced back at Jake, who had been sitting so still, so quiet. She hadn't realized, she hadn't even considered how much of his life was different from hers. "He can't afford to buy books, but he comes here every day," Miss Clara said, her voice softer now. "Exactly," the man replied. "This library is his escape. It's the only place he feels safe. If you saw his home, you'd understand. I see him here every afternoon, trying to learn as much as he can." Miss Clara's chest tightened as she looked down at Jake, who had barely looked up. She felt a deep sense of regret for her earlier words, but it wasn't enough to fix what she had said. Miss Clara stood there, trying to process what the man had just told her. Her mind raced, going over every moment she had watched Jake, every judgment she had silently made. She had assumed the worst about him, and now, hearing the truth, she felt ashamed. The man continued, his voice quiet but firm. "Jake's mom works 2 jobs, and his dad isn't around. They struggle just to get by. He's never had the luxury of owning books. He comes here because this is the only place where he can feed his hunger for knowledge." Miss Clara looked over at Jake again. He was still sitting at the table, his eyes on the pages, though his shoulders seemed to slump lower now. He must have known people had been talking about him. He must have felt embarrassed, but he never said a word. The man took a step closer to her, his voice kind. "He's not here to waste anyone's time. He's here because he wants to learn. He wants more for himself." Miss Clara felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had been so quick to judge. She had watched Jake for weeks, assuming he was just another kid wasting his day away, when in reality, he was working hard to build his future. Jake's story wasn't just about poverty, it was about resilience. It was about a kid trying to make something of himself, even if he didn't have the same opportunities as others. Miss Clara swallowed hard, realizing she had completely misunderstood him. She thought of how many kids like Jake must have passed through the library without anyone truly seeing them. She sighed, feeling heavier than she ever had before. Miss Clara stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words pressing heavily on her chest. She had spent so much time thinking she was doing her job right, maintaining order, and making sure everyone followed the rules. But what she hadn't realized was that she had missed the most important part of being a librarian, understanding the people who walked through those doors. She glanced over at Jake again. He was still there sitting quietly with his book. His eyes were hidden behind the pages, but there was something about the way he sat that made her heart ache. He looked so small, so fragile, like he was carrying the world on his shoulders, but didn't have anyone to share the weight with. Her mind replayed the sharp words she had said to him earlier. She had called him a time waster. She had dismissed him as someone who didn't belong there. Now she realized how wrong she had been. The more she thought about it, the more regret built up inside her. She had made a quick judgment, and it had hurt someone. It wasn't just about books or borrowing them, it was about making people feel welcome. She hadn't done that for Jake. A knot tightened in her stomach. What kind of librarian had she been? How could she have been so blind to the truth? She wanted to apologize, but she didn't know how. Words seemed too small for the regret she felt, and yet she couldn't just walk away from this without doing something. She had to fix this. As she stood there, she took a deep breath, determined to make things right, even if it took more than just words. The next morning, Miss Clara couldn't stop thinking about Jake. The more she reflected on her actions, the more she realized how much she had misjudged him. She knew she had to do something that would show him she didn't see him as a nuisance anymore, but as someone who truly mattered. When Jake walked into the library that day, Miss Clara was ready. She watched him quietly enter as usual, and make his way to his usual spot by the window. He didn't notice her standing near the front desk, staring at him with a mixture of regret and determination. As he settled into his seat, she took a deep breath and walked toward him. Her heart was pounding, but she knew this was the right thing to do. "Jake," she called softly, her voice different from before. Jake looked up, his eyes a little wary. "Yes, Miss Clara." She hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice steady but sincere. "I was wrong to judge you. I thought you were wasting your time, but now I understand you're here for something much more important. You come here to learn, and I respect that." Jake blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such an apology. He looked down at the book in his hands, his fingers slowly tracing the edges. "I'm really sorry for what I said," she continued. "I was unfair to you. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." Jake finally looked up, and for the first time he gave her a small tentative smile. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I understand." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Miss Clara felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had taken the first step in making things right. From that day on, things between Miss Clara and Jake were different. The tension that had once hung in the air every time he walked into the library was gone. She made a conscious effort to greet him warmly each time he arrived, and over time she learned more about him. She found out that Jake loved science fiction, and dreamed of becoming an engineer one day. He had a passion for learning that stretched far beyond the library's walls, but it was clear that books were his escape. They were his way of reaching for something bigger, even when his circumstances held him back. Miss Clara also noticed something else. Every day, after Jake finished reading, he would carefully return the books to their spots on the shelves. He wasn't just reading, they were his treasures, the closest thing to a world of his own. One afternoon, Miss Clara decided to do something special. She took a few books off the shelf, ones she thought Jake might enjoy, and placed them in a bag. When he walked in, she smiled at him. "Jake, I've got something for you," she said. He looked at her curiously, as she handed him the bag. His eyes widened when he saw the titles inside. "Are these for me?" Miss Clara nodded. "I'd like you to take them home. I know you don't have many books, so I want you to have these. It's the least I can do." Jake's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Clara. I really appreciate it." It wasn't much, but for Jake, it was everything. And for Miss Clara, it was a new beginning, one where she saw the true value of the library, not just as a place for books, but as a place for opportunity, for growth and for second chances.